and Harriet, we'll go to you real quick, and then we'll just move on down, and then you all can leave as we finish up. So any questions for Representative Hagelin? Seeing none, thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it. So now we'll go to Mr. Hearn.
Thank you, Chairman Graves, and the members of the T&I Committee for hosting this Member Day. I appreciate the opportunity to share my concerns about the FAA. I've been flying for 42 years with thousands of hours experience in the air and several licenses, certificates, and ratings. I've had extensive conversation with a great deal of individuals within the aviation industry and the issues they face with the FAA. I'm here to speak about the aviation community's displeasure with inconsistency in the Flight Standard District offices, more commonly known in the industry as FSDOs, and the ongoing pilot shortage. I've heard from multiple sectors in the aviation community, from heavy lift helicopter operators to aircraft repairmen, about the serious lack of consistency from FSDOs. It is a common complaint that each FSDO office and inspector interprets and administers the rules set forth by the FAA. There are 77 FSDO offices operating in the United States, meaning that 77 different possible ways that rules and regulations can be interpreted. And that doesn't even account for the individual inspectors at each FSDO interpreting rules in their own way. If federal oversight is going to happen, there needs to be a consistent application of the rules and regulations across the board. The aviation community is frustrated about the FAA claims they oversee safety and regulatory standards across the entire U.S., when in reality there is a complete disconnect between the FAA office in Washington, D.C. and individual FSDOs. FSDOs are meant to be a resource to the aviation community, but instead they've just become unhelpful with their inconsistent guidance and burdensome certification processes. This is not a new issue. Those in the aviation industry have been asking Congress to look into the FSDO inconsistencies since the early 2000s. It is time we get to the root of the issue and demand the FAA finally take control and create consistency within their FSDOs. At the end of the day, if the FAA is going to operate at a federal level, they must ensure all FSDOs interpret rules and safety standards equally, treating and regulating everyone the same way from FSDO to FSDO. Pilot shortages are another major issue for the aviation community. We've seen how the pilot shortage has wreaked havoc in the commercial air industry with an unprecedented amount of flight delays and cancellations. A key factor in this crisis is the shortage of designated pilot examiners, DPEs, but the FAA has done nothing to address this. There has been a shortage of pilot examiners for years now. Plenty of students love flying and they're ready to embark on a career as a commercial pilot, but are having to wait far too long for their certifications. To make matters worse, student pilots cannot work towards other certifications while they're waiting. For example, a student pilot can't get paid for their flying hours until their private pilot license, making it financially difficult for most to work towards getting their commercial license. Another issue that was brought to my attention just last night from a constituent are the delays in medical clearances. The FAA Medical Division requires pilots to respond to their requests 30 to 60 days, yet takes 8 to 10 months to respond to pilots. Every day that a FAA fails to address these critical issues, they continue to delay commercial pilots entering the workforce. It's totally unacceptable. Before I go, I want to remind everyone that the FAA's stated mission is, and this is a direct quote, to, quote, provide the safest, most efficient aerospace industry in the world and satisfy the needs of aviation interests of the United States, end quote. The FAA has failed to uphold this mission. As a result, the aviation system in the country has become less efficient, more expensive, and increasingly burdensome for the people who work to improve the aviation industry. If the FAA wants to be a trusted regulatory body, there must be consistency and transparency in how rules are upheld and how certifications are granted. I'm a proud member of the aviation community, and as I mentioned, I have been so for 4 decades. I hope my testimony today has helped my colleagues on this committee understand just how harmful the FAA has become to this industry. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Hearn. Any questions for Representative Hearn?
Just not a question really, but a comment is that this is really a nonpartisan set of issues you've outlined here. You've outlined the issues. We've been trying to deal with these issues for some time with the FAA, and I really appreciate you bringing these up. And hopefully we'll have an opportunity in the FAA bill to push the FAA in the right direction on this and many other issues that we're dealing with the FAA. So thanks for bringing that up.
May I respond for 1 sec? There are so few pilots or people that are involved in the aviation industry. My colleague next to me has been a pilot for a number of years. I think it's important, and I really appreciate this opportunity to actually hear from people who are members of Congress who actually have been flying, because we get a different conversation back home with our constituents. And I meant completely to imply that we do a bipartisan solution, because it has been restricted to the aviation industry. And I know I've talked to the chairman about this. This is something we need to get after for safety and for the future of commercial air service in this country. I yield back. Thank you so much for allowing me
I
to
just know, as a father of a son who's planning to fly in the Navy, and he's delaying his entry until the pipeline for training is shorter than 9 months. I understand exactly what the shortage of examiners and trainers means, and that just translates on the commercial side as well.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you, Representative Hearn. I appreciate it. Well said. We'll now move on to Bill Johnson from Ohio. Representative Johnson, 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Larson and distinguished members of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify on my top priority for the 2023 FAA reauthorization bill. I understand that the purpose of the FAA reauthorization is to reauthorize the FAA and its programs that are designed to provide steady funding for maintaining and improving airport infrastructure and aviation safety. That said, I bring to your attention a concern with the requirements for primary airport status, which is currently defined solely by the number of commercial passenger enplanements, the number of commercial passengers that come in and out of an airport. This definition does not consider other critical factors that can drastically increase the amount of air traffic received by an airport and the associated maintenance cost, particularly public airports that are used by the U.S. military. I recently sponsored legislation, H.R. 2558, that would amend the requirements for primary airport status to include public airports that are also used by a military air reserve station. This bill has bipartisan and bicameral support. While it contains just one small provision, H.R. 2558 would be greatly beneficial to airports that provide a critical service to our nation by supporting a military air reserve station, in addition to serving commercial, cargo, and general aviation air traffic, but may not otherwise meet the current criteria for commercial enplanements to receive the funding provided to primary airports. Presently, there is just one airport that falls into this category, and that's the Youngstown-Warren Regional Airport. This airport is located in Trumbull County, Ohio, and together with the Youngstown Air Reserve Station, it serves as one of the largest employers in the Mahoning Valley region. Although this airport presently receives only a small amount of commercial air traffic, the runways are used every single day by general aviation, cargo, and especially military aircraft performing training in critical national security operational missions. The increased funding provided to primary airports would enable the airport to advance much-needed maintenance, including a runway resurfacing project that would not only increase safety and operations for military and other categories of aviation, but would assist in their effort to attract additional commercial air operations as well. Additionally, should any of the other airports supporting an air reserve station, and there are only a handful of these air reserve stations located at public airports rather than a military base, fall below 10,000 annual commercial enplanements, this legislation would ensure that they would also maintain their primary airport status and associated funding. These airports are economic drivers for their local communities, but they also perform an important role for America's national security and military readiness. I strongly believe this essential military usage that doesn't exist at most commercial airports should enable the Youngstown-Warren Airport and any other airport supporting an air reserve station to receive the funding that is so very critical for maintaining the airport for the unique aviation traffic that they serve. The $1 million annual maintenance and operations funding of a primary airport versus The mere $150,000 annually for non-primary airports will drastically increase the Youngstown-Warren Airport's ability to maintain the safety and infrastructure needs of American aviators, especially our essential military aviators. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify. It's my hope to work with you to ensure that this year's FAA reauthorization is designed to meet the maintenance and infrastructure funding needs of our nation's aviation sector, especially the military sector. And I respectfully urge you to include the text of H.R. 2558. It's really very simple in the 2023 FAA reauthorization bill. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Are there any questions for Bill? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony, and we'll include it in the record.
Thank you very much.
We'll next move to Mr. Muser from Pennsylvania. Dan, you have 5 minutes. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, Chairman Graves. Really appreciate it. I want to certainly thank you, Chairman Graves, as well as Subcommittee Chair Garrett Graves and Ranking Member Larson, members of the committee, for giving me this opportunity to testify. I'm here today to inform the committee of a few reasons why it is important to reopen the EAS, the Essential Air Service Program for rural airports, or other types of funding that would assist smaller local airports stay open or reopen. First, reopening the EAS program is valuable, of course, to rural airports that are lacking commercial air service. The program is meant to support rural communities in accessing the nation's airspace with commercial air service and reopening the program for communities who have lost this important resource. EAS brings with it tremendous economic and quality of life benefits, which you can relate to, for the residents it serves. The absence of commercial air services leaves rural communities without access to the nation's airspace, forcing residents to travel hours to the closest airport for service. This hinders economic growth, obviously, and for business, and creates an obstacle to revitalize efforts in such communities. An example, in my district, where a city is being negatively impacted by the lack of air service, is Williamsport, Pennsylvania. It is a city of 27,000 people with over 200,000 people living in surrounding counties. This region of northeast central Pennsylvania is also home to 9 different colleges and universities and hundreds of businesses. We also have a lot of activity due to the natural gas play, and not having the airport open is absolutely hindering that. The nearest airport to Williamsport is driving at least 2 hours. So Williamsport Regional Airport lost commercial air service in October 2021 when American Airlines pulled out of the market. This decision has left the surrounding communities without commercial air service since then. Williamsport originally qualified for the EAS, but was not enrolled in the program because in 2008, U.S. Airways decided to provide service to the community without program funding. So the airport lost the ability to be within the EAS when the program closed. U.S. Airways only made this decision to fly without program funding when the airline found that it was outbid by a competitor. My apologies, James. Unfortunately, Williamsport's qualification got pulled when Congress decided to close the program during a previous FAA reauthorization, which you're aware of, leaving Williamsport without a viable option for commercial airline. Williamsport is not alone in lacking this air service. There are 13 other airports that recently lost air service, and this statistic will grow. Opening the EAS for rural communities will alleviate the congestion at larger airport hubs by having smaller airports share the load. And we see that. We see the safety concerns. We see the high level of congestion taking place. It's almost on the news perhaps once a week. So this program would improve air safety for passengers flying across the country during a time when the FAA has noted too many close calls of serious runway incursions. And I have introduced a bill supporting America's Airports Act, as well as the Essential Air Service Reform Act, one of which just completely opens up the EAS, the other provides reforms to it. So I would just add in my last minute that this is a very, very, very serious issue for the city of Williamsport. It's where the Little League World Series takes place. Its growth is very much dependent upon it. Community leadership is willing to provide many subsidies as well and funding in the millions to help support it. Such additional funding may likely only be necessary via an EAS or the other type of funding for the community service program for a short time, just to get it up and going and get a reasonable commercial flight to a reasonable hub. So I conclude. I appreciate it, and I really appreciate particularly Chairman Graves, your listening on this issue, as well as Chairman Garrett Graves for all of your consideration, and I yield back.
Anybody have any questions for Representative Muser? Seeing none, thanks, Dan, for coming in, and we'll make your testimony part of the record. Next up, we have Mr. Landsman from Ohio. Thanks for being here. Greg, you have 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Larson, all the members of this committee. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. We should all know by now what has happened in East Palestine, Ohio. The derailment, as you all know, was catastrophic, not only for the families in the proximity to the site, but to those miles and miles away, like my constituents down the Ohio River in Cincinnati, in southwest Ohio. Many Ohioans were rightfully concerned for their own health and safety and for the health and safety of their children. Norfolk Southern has assisted somewhat, but families were displaced, and there are lasting concerns of long-term health, loss in property value, and access to clean drinking water. So my request today is that the committee consider this preventable incident in East Palestine, Ohio, during the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration reauthorization work. I'll also put a plug in for Congressman Bill Johnson and Amelia Sykes's bill, the Rail Act, which will help to decrease the number of derailments throughout the country. It is a bipartisan bill supported by, among others, many, many of us in the Ohio delegation on both sides. In addition, I'd like to talk a little bit about the FAA reauthorization and ask that you consider guardrails to airports and how they interact with ground transportation teams. I happen to have a business in my district that does a lot of ground transportation work throughout the country and want to be a strong advocate for them. But I also have, as I've gotten further into this issue, appreciate that it has a lot to do with just competition and bringing prices down. And that is what I think some call curbside equity, and just allowing everyone to compete for the same rates and fees and rentals to ensure fair usage for travelers. It will bring costs down, and it just makes a lot of sense in terms of creating the kind of competition that we see in other marketplaces, but at the moment, airports have a sort of monopoly on these services in a way that I don't think makes sense. And again, this I think is bipartisan and will lead to just better services and prices for travelers. So with that, I yield back, and thank you.
Anyone have any questions for Mr. Landsman? Seeing none, thanks, Craig, for coming in. We'll make it part of the record. Mr. Thompson.
That'll help.
Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Larson, members of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, thanks for the opportunity to be able to just present my priorities for the 118th Congress. Greatly appreciated. Representing one of the most rural districts east of the Mississippi River, a full one-third of the landmass of Pennsylvania, access to quality infrastructure and reliable transit is critical to farmers, small businesses, manufacturers, and others, everyday citizens throughout my district. In order to improve and maintain the infrastructure of the United States, it's crucial we support programs to promote new, innovative technologies that advance all aspects of our country's transportation needs. I want to touch on Essential Air Service initially first here. The Essential Air Service program was established to ensure taxpayers in small rural communities had continued connectivity to the entire national transportation system by subsidizing commuter and certified air carriers for their services to these areas. This program is critical in rural America and has provided links to hub airports at over 175 locations that would otherwise lack commercial air service. With 2 airports that participate in the EAS program in my district, I see firsthand the importance of maintaining this program for all Americans who live in rural areas. Additionally, given the success of the program in connecting rural communities to the rest of the world and the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic for rural airports, I support re-examining eligibility requirements for EAS to expand the program's reach in the 2023 FFA reauthorization. I put a word of support in for what Congressman Muser had shared. I share representing just a small portion of the city of Williamsport, and quite frankly, their lack of commercial service was a decision of an airline, questionable question at that. And but it also shows that what can happen with the Essential Air Service of because that airport absolutely was robust in just the past number of years. So while it's important to fully assess the impacts of changes to the program, our nation's rural and community and small communities depend on commercial air service for transportation, medical supplies, commercial goods, and access to the larger business markets. I'd like to touch briefly on the bus testing facility program. The bus testing facility program at the Pennsylvania State University is operated by the Thomas D. Larson Pennsylvania Transportation Institute, tests new transit bus models for safety, structural integrity, durability, reliability, performance, noise, and fuel economy. The program tests new bus models before they are purchased by transit agencies, and this often helps address programs before the fleet is built, potentially saving considerable money and time. Since the beginning of this program, more than 530 new bus models have been tested, resulting in over 10,000 documented design failures. Without this program, manufacturers will not be able to sell new buses, transit agencies will not be able to acquire new buses, and consumers will be left with fewer options for transportation. Continuing to invest in initiatives like the bus testing facility program ensures a safer, more reliable future for mass transit throughout the country. WOTUS. Unfortunately, despite repeated bipartisan opposition and formal disapproval by the House and Senate, President Biden continues to push forward a final waters of the United States rule. That extends the administration's attack on America's farmers, ranchers, and producers, simply recognizing longstanding agriculture exemptions that have been too narrowly applied for decades does not make up for, once again, silencing the voices of American agriculture. American farmers and ranchers and landowners deserve a WOTUS definition that's fair to agriculture, maintains a historical reach of the Clean Water Act, and provides consistency and clarity, none of which is achieved by the administration's rule. And workforce development infrastructure, finally. Rebuilding our nation's infrastructure will require more than just bridges, roads, and waterways. It will require development of a skilled workforce that can design, build, and maintain that infrastructure. And as co-chair of the bipartisan House Career and Technical Education Caucus, I recognize the importance and value CTE programs offer to individuals, especially those in infrastructure sectors, and it is important that they have a seat at the table. And so I just respectfully request you include dedicated funding to workforce development programs, including CTE programs, and any supplemental infrastructure program. Really appreciate the work of this committee, and certainly my written testimony includes additional priorities. And with that, much appreciation, and I yield back.
Thank you, GT. Anybody have any questions?
I wasn't aware of the bus testing facility program. It's at Penn State. Are there other programs in the country, other universities doing that work?
I think there are, but it's pretty limited. So a lot of buses that service, throughout all the congressional districts represented here probably have models of buses that were tested. And, and those testings are important, proven by the fact that over the years that they've done that, they found, thousands of failures that the bus manufacturers were able to correct before the buses actually went on the market and were purchased by the transit agencies.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Thanks for bringing that up. Appreciate it.
Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we'll include your testimony in the record. Ms. Bergen from California, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Larson, for the opportunity to testify this morning on my transportation and infrastructure priorities to the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. My district includes the Port of Los Angeles, the busiest port by container volume in the country. It's an economic engine, not just for my district and the greater Los Angeles area, but for the entire country, and it imports goods for American businesses and consumers throughout the entire country. In the Water Resources Development Act of 2020, billions of dollars in new funding were unlocked for donor ports like the Port of Los Angeles, which contribute far more to the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund than received back. However, the recent 2023 work plan of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers does not reflect these policy changes. It's important for the committee to provide oversight and get answers to ensure the Corps implements the Water Resources Development Act of 2020 in line with congressional intent. These port infrastructure and maintenance funds are important to ensure we have a strong supply chain without backlogs from outdated infrastructure. Next, as we work to maintain strong infrastructure for our ports, it's critical that the committee also prioritize air quality and public health for port communities. While Congress has made significant investments to address emissions from cargo equipment and trucks, rising shipping emissions are a major challenge. We will need further research and innovation to develop zero-emission ships that will improve air quality and reduce climate pollution. I encourage the committee to work to create a zero-emission vessel innovation fund within the Maritime Administration to provide $500 million in financing for pilot projects, demonstration projects, and research of zero-emissions marine vessels and retrofitting of existing vessels. Next, as the Department of Transportation implements the Infrastructure and Jobs Law, this committee will play an important oversight role to ensure the funds reach communities that have faced decades of underinvestment and air pollution. This is part of the Biden administration's Justice 40 initiative. Some specific examples of programs that need to reach disadvantaged communities often left behind, like those in my district, are the capital investment grants to expand public transit, including the planned West Santa Ana Light Rail line, which would connect communities in southeastern LA County with downtown Los Angeles, or the low-no bus program to support zero-emission buses. Both Long Beach and Los Angeles have goals for 100% zero-emission transit buses by 2030. Or the electric vehicle charging infrastructure, which needs to include funding for multifamily homes and shared vehicles for non-car owners at public housing. Finally, as the committee works on the FAA reauthorization bill, I want to highlight a few priorities of our hardworking flight attendants and transport workers that I share. These include the Cabin Air Safety Act to protect pilots, flight attendants, and passengers from toxic cabin air, or the Protection from Abusive Passengers Act to hold passengers accountable if they assault a crew member or passenger, and the Global Aircraft Maintenance Safety Improvement Act to ensure one standard of safety and security applies to our aircraft maintenance, regardless of where it is repaired. I want to thank the committee for the time, for your consideration of these priorities. I look forward to working with the committee this Congress to advance them forward. I yield back.
Thank you, Nanette. Anyone have any questions committee? Seeing none, thank you very much, Representative Bergen. We'll make sure that your testimony gets included in the record. We'll next move on to Ms. Escobar from Texas.
Thank you so
Veronica.
much. Thank you, Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Larson, for holding today's hearing. I have the honor of representing El Paso, Texas, a community on the U.S.-Mexico border and one of the busiest trade corridors in the country. The El Paso ports of entry serve as critical gateways to global trade, moving nearly $82 billion in trade and commerce annually through our land ports. This committee plays a meaningful role in ensuring our community has infrastructure to support the region's transportation network, which contributes to our local, state, and national economy. I'd like to take this opportunity to expand on several of our regional priorities for your consideration. And thank you so much, Ranking Member Larson, for visiting the community several weeks ago. Chairman Graves, I'd love for you to visit as well so that you can see some of those great investments at work as well. This year, I'm excited to have submitted several transportation and infrastructure community project funding requests that would make critical investments in our region, one of which is a $4 million funding request for the El Paso Regional Ports of Entry System Development Study and Operational Plan, which would conduct a study of the key needs of all land ports from Tornillo in East El Paso County to Santa Teresa to our west in New Mexico. The goal of the study will be to initiate a plan comprehensive to all ports and infrastructure corridors as a unique regional system. Our land ports of entry network needs key improvements and analysis so that we develop a targeted understanding of how they should be developed into a cohesive transportation system. Next, I'd like to shift to a few priorities that will play critical roles for the future of transportation in El Paso. The first being an exemption through the FAA to the perimeter rule to allow for nonstop flights between El Paso and Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. Our region's significant military presence, from serving the two largest Department of Defense installations in the nation, Fort Bliss and White Sands Missile Range, passenger demand, and airline competitiveness would all benefit from such a change. A study by the Brookings Institution also found that adding a single nonstop flight from Reagan National to a new city generates $100 million in economic activity and 1,000 new jobs. That is why I urge this committee to consider including in this year's FAA this request to allow for beyond perimeter exemptions. The second request is to increase funding for the FAA's Airport Improvement Program, which provides more than $3 billion in entitlement and discretionary grant funds for a network of more than 3,300 eligible airports, including the El Paso International Airport. The third request is to expand federal funding opportunities to support projects like the El Paso Northeast Rail Spur and Overpass Initiative, which involves connecting the Union Pacific Rail Line in Northeast El Paso to more than 5,000 acres of city-owned contiguous developable land. The land is ideal for large-scale economic development projects with significant private capital investment, which would stimulate tens of thousands of high-quality jobs. The fourth request is support increasing funding for RAISE grants and other federal funding opportunities that support the revitalization of communities and the development of green spaces through projects such as the Deck Plaza project in El Paso, a 7-acre project that we hope will be located above I-10. Lastly, a new land port infrastructure development grant program is needed to bolster border infrastructure projects to create operational efficiency and other improvements. International bridges in communities like mine must be modernized to keep pace with the exponential increases in trade with Mexico, especially as we reshore and nearshore manufacturing. It will strengthen supply chains, improve operational capabilities and infrastructure capacity, and spur economic growth. I urge you to support these requests. I thank you for your time, and I appreciate your leadership. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Representative Escobar. Any questions for Veronica? Seeing none, we'll include your testimony in the record, and thank you very much for coming. Next, we have, is it Sablon Did I pronounce that right? I'm horrible at pronunciation.
Exactly as I would say it.
From Northern Marianas, thanks for being here, and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Larson and members of the committee for the invitation to submit testimony as you develop a bill to reauthorize the Federal Aviation Administration's funding and programs authorities beyond fiscal year 2023. I'm asking that the committee consider including my district, the Northern Mariana Islands, among the locations eligible to participate in the Department of Transportation's Essential Air Service or EAS program. Adding the Northern Mariana Islands to Alaska and Hawaii among the locations exempt from EAS requirements would help ensure scheduled air service is always available to residents and visitors of the Marianas. The Northern Marianas is 14 islands, separate islands, ranging from just south of Chichijima all the way down to Guam. But we only service 3 of the islands. And one of the islands actually has a Air Force project, the Divert Airfield, which ironically is going to get more expensive to get down there for visitors and also for contractors. Air service, of course, is vital and the only practical means of locations between the islands of the Marianas. Commuter air service can, however, be unreliable and fare prices have increased significantly in recent years. One carrier has been providing air service between the 3 Mariana Islands of Rota, Tinian, and Saipan, and to Guam for over a decade. However, in December 2021, the carrier abruptly suspended all air service for over a week and did not resume scheduled service for 3 weeks due to disputes over fees with the local port authority. These actions prompted the former Marianas governor to use ARPA funds to have a second air carrier set up shop in the Marianas to provide partially subsidized community air service between the islands. However, when the new Commonwealth Government administration took office in July, the use of Rescue Act funds were questioned and subsequently halted, causing the second carrier to shut down operations and close business. These events caused a rapid increase in inter-island fare rates that have remained historically high. I could stand at an airport in Saipan and see the island of Tinian 3 miles down, and it cost me $80 to fly round trip. And among communities in the Northern Marianas, although communities in the Northern Marianas were originally eligible for EAS, none of our airports were receiving EAS subsidies between September 30 of 2010 and September 30 of 2011, and therefore became ineligible when the FAA Modernization and Reform Act of 2012 was enacted, changing the definition of eligible places for receiving EAS. And to ensure that communities in the Marianas will always have at least a minimal level of scheduled air service, EAS eligibility must be reconsidered and the law amended. This change will not automatically, place Marianas airports in the program, but it will ensure that EAS assistance is available if ever needed. I respectfully ask that the Northern Marianas be included in the exemptions to EAS requirements along with Alaska and Hawaii. Legislative text effectuating this change is attached for your reference, Mr. Chairman. I thank the committee for its consideration of this proposal for inclusion in the Federal Aviation Administration Reauthorization Act of fiscal year 2024. And I welcome the chairman and Mr. Caraballo right now, but also Mr. Larson to come visit the Marianas. If we go on a commercial airline, it will take us no more than 36 hours to get there from Washington, D.C. Takes me 26 hours to get here. And then when I come to my district, I still need to fly that 5-minute hopper that costs $80 round trip to visit, another island. And another island is 20 minutes down the further down. So, yeah, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Saban. Any questions from the committee? Seeing none, we'll make sure that your testimony gets in the record. We would love to come out.
Yes,
But with that, appreciate you coming in.
no, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Have a good day.
Next, we have Mr. Kuzar from Texas.
Thank you.
5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, thank you for hearing our policy priorities, especially as it relates to the reauthorization of the Federal Aviation Administration. As a Congress, we should focus on the workers who keep our aviation system running, from pilots to flight attendants to air traffic controllers, maintenance crews, luggage workers, the folks at the ticket counters, and everyone in between. In my testimony, I want to focus on these workers, and especially those who are most often left behind, airport service workers. All these employees are our constituents, and in my largely working-class district, my constituents keep multiple airports running: the San Antonio Airport, the Austin Airport, the San Marcos Airport, and they move millions of people throughout Texas and in and out of Texas each year. Every person working in these airports deserves a living wage with benefits, a safe workplace, and paid time off to spend with their families. Let's face it, these last few years, we've seen how our air travel systems are so fragile, and the only thing that held it all together were the workers, especially those who are lowest paid and work the longest hours. Without wheelchair attendants, elderly passengers wouldn't be able to navigate our airports with dignity. Without cabin cleaners and janitors, we wouldn't have clean facilities that we all expect. And when these workers encountered challenges like the pandemic, giant storms, surges of passenger traffic, they've stepped up. But despite the hard work of everyday people, too often we've seen companies not step up. We've seen corners get cut and prices get jacked up. It doesn't have to be this way, and we have an opportunity this year to do something about it. States, localities, and airport authorities across the country have adopted wage and benefit standards, but there's many major airports with no minimum standards other than the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. That's why I'm proud that places like the Austin Airport in my district have set a $20 an hour minimum wage for workers, whether we work in concessions, custodial, or customer service. If we want a top-notch air travel system for this country, we need national wage and benefit standards for our airports. I want to share the story of a fellow Texan. Dorian Johnson is a passenger service agent at the Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. We have lots of representation here from Texas, including from Houston and Dallas at the table here. And he came and visited my office alongside folks from my district, talking about the full-time work he does helping passengers with disabilities navigate the airport. It's tough work, but if your family member is getting helped around by Dorian, you really appreciate that tough work. But Dorian has no affordable health care, no paid vacation, and no paid sick time. So what I'm saying is that a critically important set of airport workers at one of the largest airports in the world can't see a doctor when they're sick, can't take a day off to get well. The proposed H.R. 1499, the Good Jobs for Good Airports Act, authored by my mentor and friend and TNI committee member, Congressman Chuy Garcia, will set national wage and benefit levels at major airports that receive federal funding and ensures that every airport job is a good job. For my state, this will be huge. It will improve the lives immediately for 37,000 Texans. People like Dorian will have a decent wage, affordable health care, and some paid time off. Alongside those standards in the Good Jobs, Good Airports Act, we can do even more to make the FAA reauth one that respects the working men and women in this industry. We can guarantee adequate training standards for our pilots. We can strengthen safety for our frontline aviation workers who have endured assaults. We can ensure adequate staffing for our air traffic controllers to make air travel at rapidly growing airports like mine be more smooth and safe. We can create good-paying American jobs by not offshoring airplane maintenance. And we can make sure that with this bill, the working people of America are truly better off. And that would really be commendable and a testament to our work. Thank you for your leadership and consideration.
Thank you, Greg. Anybody have any questions for Representative Kuzar? Seeing none, we'll make sure that your testimony gets in the record. Thanks for coming in. And we'll continue with Texas. Representative Garcia, thanks for being here. In 5
Thank you,
minutes.
Mr. Chairman, and you're absolutely right. Texas is definitely in the House today. Thank you so much for the time to speak with you today. I'm eager to share my transportation and infrastructure-related priorities to this committee. It is our responsibility to ensure that our constituents have functional, safe, and reliable transportation options and infrastructure systems. Our nation's transportation and infrastructure system must serve as a convenience to all Americans, not a hindrance. In my district, blocked railroad crossings are a major issue. My district leads the nation in the number of reported blocked railroad crossings. In 2022, there were 3,429 reports of blocked intersections in Houston alone, and the East End, a neighborhood in my district, had the most reports of any other neighborhood. Thanks to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, there is now a public database for reporting these incidents of blocked rail crossings. However, much more needs to be done. I have picked up on the work of Representative Jim Cooper from last Congress and introduced the Don't Block Our Communities, or the D-Block Act. This bill would prohibit rail carriers from blocking intersections with passing trains for more than 10 minutes and allow the Transportation Secretary to issue penalties for violations. Block crossings are not only a major inconvenience, but also a real danger to our communities by slowing down emergency vehicles, police, fire, and ambulances. My neighbors have even seen children making the dangerous decision to crawl underneath a stopped train to get to school on time. This is outrageous and unacceptable. We must make a change and give the Federal Railroad Administration legislative options to enforce penalties. I hope that this committee will take up this bill and seriously consider the safety concerns of block crossings in my community and communities across America. Additionally, I would like to touch on an essential priority for the upcoming Federal Aviation Administration authorization. Through this package, I want to emphasize my support for airport workers. As always, I stand with our nation's unions, and I want to ensure that airport employee members and their families have the support and dignity that they deserve and are given the freedom to organize and to get a livable wage. In the face of a challenging commercial air travel market, we must make sure that airport workers make livable wages and are supported in the workplace. I commend my colleagues and my other half of the Garcia caucus, Representative Chuy Garcia, for his Good Jobs for Good Airports Act, which does exactly that. I'm a proud co-sponsor of his bill, and I hope to see it in the final FAA authorization. Finally, as the whip for the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, I want to ensure that this authorization advocates for safe, efficient, and accessible national airport system to satisfy the needs of the Latino interests and consumers in the United States. It is also important that we certify that Latinos have equal opportunity in recruitment, hiring, training, and advancement in the federal employment system. I am grateful for the opportunity to share my priorities today, and I encourage all members of this committee to take them into serious consideration. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Sylvia. Anyone have any questions for Representative Garcia? Seeing none, we'll make sure your testimony gets in the record. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Next up from Texas, we have Representative Crockett. Jasmine, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member and the entire committee for your time today in offering this opportunity to discuss issues that are critical to my district and this country as we prepare for the FAA reauthorization. So just to orient you, I proudly represent Southwest Airlines. I also have Dallas Love Field. I also have Dallas Executive Airport, and Airbus is also located in my district, which for those of you that don't know, Airbus is probably the largest manufacturer of helicopters in the country. So with that, I've been kind of busy. They have made sure that I know what's going on. So since the 2018 reauthorization, millions of American families experienced the confusion and frustration of having flights delayed or canceled due to staffing shortages. These missed flights represent lost opportunities to see family, to celebrate, to grieve, to work, and so much more. We owe it to our constituents not just to hear their frustrations, but act upon them. That is why we need to bring more people into the aviation workspace. But we have tried for decades to solve this problem to no avail. We cannot rely on the same old recruitment strategies. We need to pull out all the stops and ensure we are recruiting from as wide a net as possible. That is why every stakeholder I've talked to, from the airlines to the airports, the manufacturers to the workers, support having a diverse workforce. If we talk about pilots specifically, 85% of pilots are Caucasian. That is why I urge this committee to authorize new funding to support HBCU and HSIs that offer scholarships for students majoring in the aviation field. I serve on the House Ag Committee, and we have a similar program there with our 1890 land grant institutions, and there have been tremendous results. The 1890 universities highlight an important point about this proposal. It is not enough to invest in ad hoc. It's not enough to invest ad hoc in diversity. If we really want to expand the workforce, we need to be investing in the institutions. We know from the land grant universities that this public seed money will unlock millions more in private funding. This bill will only bolster our workforce, but not only bolster our workforce, but expand our opportunities. And with that, what I want to say is this. With aviation, the opportunities to, say, become a pilot are cost prohibitive. That's just the reality. And so when you start talking about increasing diversity, one of the issues that we have is just the cost that's associated with getting the education and the training. And so this would absolutely afford so many more students from diverse backgrounds an opportunity. There are first-rate aviation degrees at HBCUs and HSIs, but the scholarships aren't there. This is why all stakeholders I spoke to in my district and across North Texas strongly support investing in scholarships to be administered by HBCU and HSIs. But just as important as who flies the planes is where the planes fly, our airports. Every year, tens of millions of families fly through mid-sized hubs airports like Dallas Love Field in my district. Many of these airports can only function because of smaller nearby reliever airports that offload some of that traffic. As we have all recently experienced, our aviation system runs on a just-in-time model with no room for delay. Backups at these reliever airports can cascade throughout the system and cause terrible consequences for our constituents as flights are delayed or canceled. Often, the cause of delays at reliever airports is that they don't have the infrastructure necessary to keep things running smoothly. For those without reliever airport in their districts, no, most of their funding comes through the airport improvement program that we fund. The discretionary grants in that program are critical for these airports to fund the improvements necessary to provide smooth service to the rest of the industry. Unfortunately, these tiny airports can't compete against their larger neighbors for the same resources. And the 2018 FAA reauthorization recognized that, which is why there is currently a set-aside for reliever airports in urban areas experiencing congestion. But talking to the reliever airports, we wouldn't know the program exists because the set-aside for these critical institutions is 2/3 of 1% of discretionary funds. That's why I'm calling on this committee to triple the funding for these reliever airports in urban congested areas to 2%. I'm running out of time, so all I'm gonna say is this. We need to make sure that we are as safe as possible, and part of that safety means that we're gonna invest in next-gen technology so that we can upgrade the technology as we saw the technology failures with Southwest. We also need to make sure that our reliever airports are not having to compete with the DFW to try to get the funding that they need, because we need to reduce the congestion that we are experiencing in our urban airports. And with that, since I have no time to yield back, I will yield.
Thank you very much, Ms. Crockett. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you for coming in, and we'll make sure your testimony gets in the record. So thanks for being here, Jasmine. Next up, we have Representative Sherrill from New Jersey. Thanks for being here. 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chairman Graves, and thank you, Mr. Carbajal, and members of the committee for providing me with the opportunity to testify today. I also want to thank my good friends and colleagues from New Jersey, Representatives Payne and Menendez, for their outstanding work to support our state's priorities on this committee. I'm going to begin today by highlighting the devastating impact of the pandemic on my constituents' current access to affordable and reliable commuting options. Commuter bus and rail lines have been hit exceptionally hard over the past 3 years as millions of Americans have stopped going into the office, and even as public health conditions have improved, these companies continue to deal with ridership that is far below pre-pandemic levels. This slow return to normalcy is now causing many operators, including a key bus provider in my district, to permanently shutter critical commuter routes that are relied upon by thousands of families. That company in my district has been shuttling New Jerseyans to Manhattan since 1870. when it was founded as a stagecoach company. Not only has this left riders in search of options to make their way from North Jersey to Manhattan, it's imperiled the good union jobs that the commuter service provides. Congress and this committee played a crucial role during the pandemic in protecting access to bus and rail commuter routes through their creation of the Coronavirus Economic Relief for Transportation Services Program, CERTS, which ensured that bus carriers could continue providing crucial commuter services and protected the jobs of thousands of workers. Significant and bipartisan funding to state public transit agencies through several COVID relief packages also helped those agencies to maintain reliable service, even as ridership collapsed. In keeping with these critical efforts, I now urge this committee, alongside the Department of Transportation, to take all available actions to protect commuter bus and transit access. This should include any necessary support to state public transit agencies to ensure that key commuter routes relied upon by families are still able to operate, as well as additional funding for Federal Transit Administration grant programs that fund public transportation operations in heavily trafficked areas. My constituents and so many millions of families nationwide rely on affordable transportation to make ends meet, and we cannot allow the pandemic to further impact their quality of life as we get back to normal. Another issue before this committee that is critical to my district's economy and the standard of living of my constituents, which you've heard about from me before, is the Gateway Tunnel Project, the nation's most critical infrastructure project. As you know, the Northeast Corridor is the most heavily trafficked rail corridor in the nation and is crucial to the travel and livelihoods of millions of Americans in our region, moving a workforce that adds more than $50 billion annually to the U.S. economy. The Gateway Project, and specifically the Hudson River Tunnel, is the linchpin at the center of this network. But the tunnel's over a century old and was heavily damaged by Superstorm Sandy, creating the risk of a devastating failure that could cost American businesses and households $16 billion over 4 years and reduce property values by $22 billion in New Jersey alone. The Hudson River Tunnel project will eliminate the risk of this potential closure and significantly expand capacity along the Northeast Corridor by doubling the number of trains able to travel under the Hudson. Amtrak estimates that the project will produce a return on investment to our region of 4-to-1 from reduced travel costs and times, greater travel safety, and reduced highway congestion. The project is also projected to create over 55,000 good-paying jobs for our constituents. I've been really excited by this committee's bipartisan work to include significant funding within the bipartisan infrastructure law to fund Gateway, as well as by the administration's efforts to expedite approvals of the project's environmental impact statement and project development agreement. But our work is not yet done. The Federal Transit Administration still needs to finalize its risk assessments for the project and award already appropriated grants to the Gateway Development Commission to allow construction to begin as soon as this summer. I strongly urge this committee to continue advocating for Gateway and overseeing the delivery of grant funding for the crucial project to ensure that we can realize its historic benefits as soon as possible. I'm so appreciative of the tremendous leadership that this committee has demonstrated in support of commuter transit and the Gateway project over the past 3 years, and look forward to continuing to engage with all of you on these critical issues. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. Anybody got any questions? Thank you, Ms. Sherrill. We'll make sure that your testimony is included in the record. Yes, ma'am. Ms. Miller, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Larson. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of Illinois' 15th District. Today, I would like to highlight the importance of levee districts like Snai Island, based near Quincy, Illinois. The levees along the Mississippi River protect critical road and rail infrastructure, thousands of acres of farmland, and countless homes and businesses from routine flooding. Levee districts like Snai face significant challenges, including record high diesel prices and shortages of skilled engineering workers. In recent years, the Snai has also faced heightened regulatory headwinds under the U.S. Army Corps Section 408 regulations. Levee district operators frequently face permitting delays or even denials for routine maintenance and improvements to their levee systems, leading to increased flood risk for local communities. The current interpretation of Section 408 has the potential for significant negative impact on the ability of levee districts like Snai Island to maintain their 100-year flood accreditation. Loss of FEMA accreditation reduces land value by as much as half, with significant negative consequences to agriculture and the local tax base. I ask that the committee consider clarifying the jurisdiction that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has over local levee sponsors. The committee has an opportunity during WRDA to prohibit the retroactive application of Section 408 to levee systems modified prior to the first issuance of the regulation in 2006. I urge the committee to affirm congressional intent and fix the misapplication of Section 408. Again, I thank you for your consideration and the chance to speak to the committee today. As a member of the Agriculture Committee, I look forward to working with the Transportation Committee to address this issue, which is critically important to Illinois and to every other state with river flood protection systems. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Hearing none, thank you, Ms. Miller. We'll make sure that your testimony is included in the record. Yes, ma'am. Chair now recognizes Mr. Carter from Georgia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me say what a pleasure it is to see you sitting in the chairman's seat less than 3 months into your first term. I am so impressed. Thank you. Thank you, seriously, and members of the committee for letting us share today our priorities before the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. The work that this committee does is extremely important, incredibly important, especially now. Our country has made significant investments in our infrastructure through the IIJA, and it's incredibly important that you oversee and ensure that those funds and programs are properly administered to the benefit of the American people. For better or worse, there are billions of taxpayer dollars appropriated towards improving our infrastructure, and we must seize the opportunity to spend it wisely in a way that serves our country the best, and y'all do that, and I want to thank you for that. As the representative of the entire coast of Georgia, and Mr. Chairman, you're very aware of my district, and you know that it is one of the most growing areas in our state and in our region. We just had the single largest economic development project ever announced for our district in the state of Georgia, and it is in the 1st Congressional District, with Hyundai building a new EV plant there that's going to be a $5.5 billion investment with over 8,100 jobs and probably that many more in the way of ancillary businesses. Therefore, infrastructure, as you can imagine, is extremely important to us. You know, it's also important because we are on the coast, the consideration of the Water Resources Development Act. And that's an opportunity to maintain and improve the pristine coastline that I've called home all of my life. Programs authorized by WRDA, like beach renourishment projects and coastal storm risk management on Tybee Island and Cumberland Island, protect our shoreline from the varying challenges posed by the Atlantic Ocean, especially hurricanes. WRDA also provides the authorizations for the continued improvements to the 2 major ports along our coast. Remember, we have the Port of Savannah, the number 3 container port in the country, the single largest and fastest growing container terminal in America. And it handles 1 out of every 8.8 loaded 20-foot equivalent container units in the U.S. now. And then we have the Port of Brunswick, which is the number 2 roll-on, roll-off port in terms of cars and trucks that come through this country. Combined, Georgia's deep water ports and inland barge terminals support more than 561,000 jobs throughout the state annually, and they contribute $33 billion in income, $140 billion in revenue, and $3.8 billion in state and local taxes to Georgia's economy. This would not be possible without your work on WRDA. A year ago this March, we completed the Savannah Harbor expansion project, allowing larger ships to come to Savannah. As you can imagine, ships have only continued to get larger, which is why I asked the committee continue to support the implementation of the new harbor modification study authorized in the 2022 WRDA. This will allow the United States to remain globally competitive as we continue to grow, especially in the Southeast. I also asked for the committee's continued support for the authorized construction for modifications to the Port of Brunswick, as it continues to grow as well. These are projects through the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and I would also ask you support them to fulfill their mission. Specifically in the Savannah district that serves our district, the U.S. Army Corps is essential to completing the permits for a wide array of projects, from bulkheads to debris removal to wetland mitigation credits. They need the resources to ensure all of this is done in a timely manner, otherwise it hinders the development of our region. As our part of the state and county grow and the country grows, it's important it has the resources to do so. Many of my areas in my district are rural and experiencing significant growth now, but this puts significant strains on their infrastructure, particularly water systems. Places like Bryan County in my district, where Hyundai, as I mentioned before, has started the largest economic development project in the state's history. They need the support to manage the incoming growth. Are cities like Nahana and Darien in my district that are much smaller but don't have the resources to update aging systems. That's why I asked the committee to continue its support for the Clean Water SRF program that helps these communities improve their water systems. Lastly, I will note that we also have several airports in our district that will be watching FAA reauthorization closely. I asked the committee appropriately fund the airport improvement program to provide the necessary resources to these airports to face increased traffic and demands. Technologies like advanced digital construction management systems have been approved for use by the Federal Highways Administration and Federal Transit Administration, and they could provide similar benefits to airports. Your committee will certainly be busy tackling these issues and more, and I want to thank you again for your important work to this important infrastructure in our district, and thank you for the opportunity to present today, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Carter. Is there any questions? Not hearing any. Thank you, and we'll make sure your testimony is included in the record. The chair now recognizes Mr. Bergman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member, for giving me the opportunity to testify this morning. As a lifelong professional aviator, both military and commercial, I have seen firsthand the evolution of air travel in the United States. From the first commercial flight in 1914 to the dawn of the jet age today, one constant has remained. We have strived and succeeded in making air travel as safe as possible. And just for the record, I would like to note that in 1914, I was not the pilot, nor was Ranking Member Carbajal the passenger. Since our last major aviation accident, Colgan Air Flight 3407, which killed 49 passengers and crew and one person on the ground, there have been 2 fatalities in domestic commercial air travel over 13 years. This incredibly impressive safety record is not an aberration or an accident. It's due to an unrelenting focus by Congress, the FAA, our pilots, and the airlines to ensure the safety of the flying public. Each incident over the last 100+ years of commercial flight has taught us lessons that we have incorporated into policy changes, aircraft design innovations, and new training methods. As this committee begins work on the FAA reauthorization bill, I'd like to ask that committee members keep safety top in your minds. After the Colgan air crash, Congress made significant changes, including requiring 1,500 hours of flight time before a first officer can fly for a U.S. commercial carrier, increased rest periods for pilots, and enhanced pilot training. It is clear these changes have and will continue to make air travel safer. I would argue that the most important provision of the 2010 FAA reauthorization bill was increasing the number of hours pilots have to spend flying prior to entering commercial aviation. There is no simulator or classroom that can replace being in the cockpit of an aircraft, whether you're above the clouds, in the clouds, or below the clouds in significantly, horrifically bad weather. While classroom training and simulators are an incredible tool for pilots to learn and trained for scenarios that would be unsafe or not feasible, they cannot replicate the real thing. Many members have expressed concerns about a pilot shortage and use this as a basis to look at ways to increase the number of new pilots. It's no secret that nearly every industry has struggled to meet labor needs post-pandemic. In fact, 2019 to 2021, domestic carriers saw 9,671 pilots retire. During that same period, however, the FAA's Civil Airman chart shows 15,591 new air transport pilots' licenses were issued. That's 6,000 pilots more than the number that retired. While there may be a labor shortage impacting the number of flights that U.S. carriers can schedule, it's not due to a lack of qualified pilots. It's imperative that we do not sacrifice flight hour requirements and passenger safety to fix a problem that doesn't exist. While I love my decades of flying commercial aircraft, I knew I couldn't do it forever. In 2007, at the age of 60, the mandatory retirement age at the time, I retired from Northwest Airlines. Later that year, Congress passed a bill to align with ICAO standards and increase the retirement age to 65, where it stands today. You cannot replace the experience of an older pilot, but as we age, our health risks increase. And at a certain point, those risks outweigh the wealth of knowledge and experience that older pilots have. If the retirement age were raised, senior commercial aviators who tend to fly larger aircraft on international routes would only be able to serve domestic destinations and a couple of countries that allow a retirement age over 65. This would force seasoned pilots into new, potentially unfamiliar aircraft with an elevated risk of health emergency, while also delaying the progression of the more junior pilots. There have been around 8 billion domestic enplanements since the last multiple fatality aviation accident in the United States. But that doesn't mean we should rest on our laurels and relax common sense requirements. We set the gold standard for global aviation safety and produce the best pilots in the world. As you craft the FAA reauthorization bill, I hope that you will build on the success these carefully crafted laws have brought to the entire aviation industry and not jeopardize the safety of our pilots, crews, and especially our passengers. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you this morning.
Thank you, Ms. Bergman. Does anybody have any questions? Thank you. We'll make sure your testimony is included in the record. We're going to take a brief break. The committee shall stand in recess, subject to call of the chair. Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure will reconvene the previously recessed hearing. The chair now recognizes Mr. Roy from Texas for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman, and I thank you for your time. It's an honor to appear before the committee. As the chair knows, I represent Central Texas. That includes San Antonio. And San Antonio proudly refers to itself as Military City, USA, home to numerous bases, one of which I represent, Fort Sam Houston, as part of Joint Base San Antonio, which includes an enormous number of other Air Force bases, including Randolph, where my mom grew up as a child of an Air Force veteran, and she grew up as an Air Force brat. And a problem that we face is that we do not have a direct flight from San Antonio, the 7th largest city in the United States, to Reagan National Airport. And we believe that's something that needs to change. You cannot have a city that's the 7th largest city that is as proximate to the nation's capital, where you have the significant number. We have an estimated 80,000 active duty service members and 159,000 veterans, enormous military defense installations and all of the various, cybersecurity and all of the defense contractors that, operate in and around the bases in San Antonio that are looking to get to Reagan and land a mere, mile from the Pentagon rather than having to land at Dulles or BWI. Now, we've dealt with this kind of thing before. I live a little closer to Austin. I represent San Antonio and the outer edges of Austin. So I tend to fly on the one direct flight we have from Austin to Reagan. We literally only have one, a Southwest flight that goes down, and it comes up to DC and goes back every day. And when I'm stuck, and then I have to go fly to the direct that United has out in Dulles, or there's some other Southwest flights that are direct to BWI. But we've got, honor flights that aren't able to come from San Antonio easily with our old veterans being able to come up here to Reagan, and it's a problem that can be solved because the barrier to achieving it is actually legislative. Because we've got some legacy rules, the perimeter rule, which sets the barrier for 1,250 miles in terms of the distance that you can fly into Reagan. A number of cities have exceptions, Austin being one of them, others that are capitals like Denver, other places, Salt Lake City. I'm going through the whole list. There's a number of cities that have exceptions. So we're looking to have either San Antonio have an exception for that or otherwise change the perimeter rule. And then there's the slot rule, which restricts the number of takeoffs and landings at DCA, at Reagan, during a given hour. These are all things that can be dealt with legislatively. I just asked the committee to please consider taking that up. It seems parochial, and some, I guess by definition it is. Members of Congress were trying to do that, but it actually is really important for our national security and our nation to have the 7th largest city that has those important military installations in San Antonio have a direct flight to Reagan to be able to land and take off a mile or two from less than a mile from the Pentagon. We think that's critically important, and I would just ask for that consideration, and happy to work with anybody on the committee to try to effectuate that change. We know there's some, lobby powers around this town that like to have their interests protected. Perhaps somebody who likes having their direct flights to Dulles and they don't want a competitive direct flight to Reagan. I get it. But I just say, using myself as an example out of Austin, I take that direct flight Southwest to DCA, but I often take the United direct flight to Dulles. Having those options is great. Sometimes I might have an event in Northern Virginia and Dulles is better. Sometimes it's just a better time, and I don't mind driving in and out of there. But it is, I think, on the border of absurd that we don't at least have the ability to have a direct flight option from San Antonio with that military center of gravity to be able to come up to Reagan right there by the Pentagon. And with that, I would yield back and appreciate the chair's time.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. Anybody got any questions? All right, thank you. We'll make sure your testimony is included in the record. The chair now recognizes Mr. Kilmer from Washington for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for hosting today's Member Day. I'm here today because I represent a region that is especially vulnerable to natural disasters, and obviously airports are critical to our emergency preparedness and to disaster response. Unfortunately, airports are not immune to the impact of natural disasters, nor to the impacts of climate change, but they are charged with responding to disaster and evacuation events. With that in mind, I think it's important that Congress steps up to ensure that airports have the resources that they need to continue their mission. An example from my neck of the woods, Fairchild International Airport in Port Angeles, Washington, where I grew up, is on the Olympic Peninsula. Fairchild Airport, in addition to being a significant economic driver, is also a vital emergency lifeline. In our rural area, the region's residents rely on Fairchild to quickly reach advanced medical care at hospitals in larger cities that may otherwise be hours away by car. On top of that, in the event of a natural disaster, such as a major seismic event or a wildfire, two threats that are unfortunately very real in our neck of the woods, the airport is designated by FEMA as an emergency staging area, and it's expected to serve the region by distributing supplies and other vital services. In other words, ensuring the resiliency of this airport and others guarantees the resiliency of our communities. We know that many more communities across the country face these resiliency challenges with their local airports also taking up the task. So I'm introducing a bill called the Resilient Airports Act alongside my colleague and your fellow committee member, Earl Blumenauer of Oregon. This bill is based on a provision in the Moving Forward Act that I worked on with the Aviation Subcommittee in the 117th Congress. Specifically, it would expand airport improvement program eligibility for critical infrastructure projects that increase the resiliency of airports against earthquakes and hurricanes and flooding and tornadoes and other natural disasters. On top of that, it would ensure that general aviation airports that are designated as a federal staging area by FEMA, like the Fairchild Airport in Port Angeles, would be included in this eligibility. That's important because it ensures that all airports that are charged with emergency and disaster response, including those that serve rural communities, are included in this opportunity to build resiliency and to continue to serve their communities. So look forward to introducing this legislation in the coming weeks, and would love to encourage the committee to consider its inclusion in the upcoming FAA reauthorization. Again, appreciate your leadership and your consideration of these requests. Happy to provide any additional information to the committee for your review, and thanks again for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Representative Kilmer. Does any member have any questions? Thank you, Representative Kilmer. We'll make sure that your testimony is included in our record. All right, next we have Representative Sherman from California.
Thank you. We need to tell the FAA to care as much about people on the ground as they do people in the air. Increases in air traffic and adjustments in flight paths are causing serious injury to the quality of life in neighborhoods I represent in the San Fernando Valley and in other areas around the country. Residents have extensively documented and reported new and substantial impacts to various communities from noise and pollution from these increasing flights. There have been several public forums, multiple bills introduced in Congress, a GAO audit, and lawsuits filed by the City of Los Angeles. The FAA should hear us, but perhaps they can't hear us over the noise generated by Van Nuys and Burbank airports. It's time for the FAA to take health and safety concerns of people on the ground seriously. Nationally, and especially in my district, performance-based navigation systems have led to the creation of more precise flight paths, resulting in the concentration of noise and associated pollution over smaller and more narrow areas. Concentration of noise leads to nonstop bombardment of particular neighborhoods, kind of a hostile takeover of the quality of life, including sleepless nights and an inability to hold conversations in one's own homes. We must provide local airports with the ability to disperse both arrivals and departures if they have proposals that can be implemented safely. That should be included in FAA reauthorization. And if the FAA is going to reject such proposals from local airports, they should have to substantiate why. We should expand Section 175 of the the last reauthorization act, to require the FAA to consider the feasibility of dispersal headings of both departures and arrivals submitted for consideration by airport operators. If a challenge to reducing noise is rooted in deconflicting airspace, then we must hire more air traffic controllers, particularly to staff the terminal radar approach control facilities. The FAA needs to hire more air traffic controllers, both for the safety of those on in the air and those on the ground. In recent years, and thanks to a GAO audit, more attention has been drawn to faulty noise metrics used by the FAA to justify its decisions, including the day-night average sound level, which I would quote the GAO, does not provide a clear picture of flight activity or associated noise levels in a given location. I supported Congresswoman Ming's bill, the Decreased Noise Level Act, and I would invite you to include that in your FAA reauthorization. Too often, the FAA fails to conduct an environmental assessment review, citing their rights to categorically exclude certain changes. We've learned the hard way that a cursory environmental review locks in impacts that can be very harmful to constituents. Moving almost lastly, everyone deserves a good night's sleep. And those who are bombarded with noise all day should not be bombarded with noise, and their houses should not shake at night. In the San Fernando Valley, this is what happens. We've introduced the Valley-wide Noise Relief Act, myself and Mr. Schiff, but I particularly focus your attention on the Restore Everyone's Sleep Tonight Act, the REST Act, put forward by our colleague Jackie Spear, who's not with us. That bill authorizes airports to have curfews between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. Unfortunately, this legislation did not receive a floor vote. We must restore local community control to the airports. Only those in localities can balance the needs of air transportation with the needs of homeowners in the area. We need the FAA reauthorization bill to provide an allowance for nighttime curfews. So many of the issues I've described are rooting in the FAA's unwillingness to incorporate input from those affected by aviation noise and other health impacts. Last year, I joined with my colleagues in the Quiet Skies Caucus in calling on the FAA to establish an advisory committee of 30 citizens who live in communities impacted by airport noise and other key stakeholders, and that needs to be part of your reauthorization bill as well, a Citizens Advisory Committee. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Does any member have any questions? Representative Sherman, we appreciate you being here. We'll make sure that your testimony is included in our record. Next up, I'd like to recognize my friend and former Senate colleague from North Carolina, the Honorable Representative Don Davis. You have 5 minutes.
Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Larson, and to my colleagues from North Carolina, Representative Rouser and Foushee. And yes, my good friend, Representative Edwards, will make sure that Chairman Graves know that you look comfortable. North Carolina looks comfortable in the chair right now. I'd like to thank all of the distinguished members of this committee for allowing me to speak on the issues that matter to the residents of North Carolina's 1st Congressional District. Much of eastern North Carolina is rural. Our communities direly need broadband. The steps this committee takes to roll out broadband in rural America will significantly improve the lives of families and businesses across my district. Also, the committee must leverage the United States Coast Guard to further support our national interests. Over the past 3 years alone, Air Station Elizabeth City completed over 570 search and recovery or rescue missions that protected approximately $850,000 in property and saved 130 lives. Additionally, the base helps with hurricane response and recovery. Economic development is crucial. The Southeast Crescent Regional Commission's mission addresses economic and poverty issues in districts like North Carolina's 1st. 13 of the 1st Congressional District's 19 counties are economically distressed. Clearly, we need help to increase workforce availability, invest in critical infrastructure needs, promote business innovation and access to capital, and so much more. I ask for you to support the SCRC so that our districts, those like mine, can successfully move into the 21st century. Other significant issues for us include hurricanes and flooding. The Federal Emergency Management Agency has done a phenomenal job training local government officials to ensure these communities have an emergency preparedness plan before each event. However, we must enhance recovery procedures. Under current law, FEMA can only restore buildings to their previous state before an event and cannot make enhancements to structures to prevent or mitigate future disasters. We need to move upstream, not downstream, and make these structures more resilient so that FEMA does not have to pour public dollars back into the same buildings that may again come crashing down. The Albemarle Sound is vital for our local community's success, but water levels continue to rise and permanent flooding follows. I ask you to support coastal flood mitigation so that my constituents' homes do not end up in the Sound. The economic well-being and safety of communities go beyond FEMA's work. Rail and freight are key parts of that same framework. Large amounts of freight are shipped in the district. We are vital to the East Coast economic engine. Economic development is essential, along with the rail corridor in communities that need good-paying jobs. The committee is encouraged to support rail and freight shipping to further foster economic opportunities while pushing more rail safety measures in rural and low-income communities. And the final issue noteworthy to highlight today is airport infrastructure and the importance of FAA reauthorization. Pitt Green Airport is a non-hub airport. Like many smaller-sized airports, it has faced economic challenges since the pandemic, losing 50 to 60% of air service. While the airport sought to use over $1 million in bipartisan infrastructure law funding to provide more access to an additional hangar, it now may be forced to allocate these funds for unrelated projects that have been delayed. We must allow smaller airports to focus on their immediate infrastructure needs in the FAA reauthorization package. I genuinely appreciate the opportunity to testify before the committee today on the critical issues impacting my constituents, and I look forward to rolling up my sleeves and going to work with you. Thank you so much. And Mr. Edwards, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone have any questions? Thank you, Representative Davis. I've got to tell you, it's difficult for me to call you representative after calling you senator for so many years. Thanks for being with us.
God bless you, my friend.
We'll make sure that your testimony is included in our record. Thank you. Next, the chair recognizes the honorable gentlewoman from Washington, Representative Schreier. Thank you. For 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to extend that same thanks to Chairman Graves and to Ranking Member Larson. I really appreciate the opportunity to come here today and testify about my priorities and concerns as a representative of Washington State's 8th Congressional District. Washington State, like all others, depends on many facets of infrastructure for trade and resiliency and economic success. Washington's 8th district, my district, depends on smooth, connected roads, reliable public transportation, comprehensive freight rail to make sure that agricultural goods can be transported, economies can grow, and communities can get to the services that they need. We also depend on critical water infrastructure, especially with increasing risk of drought, to allow our agricultural communities to flourish and make sure we have drought-resistant infrastructure. I want to talk about 3 priorities today. One is the way that the bipartisan infrastructure law is implemented. The second is FAA reauthorization. And the third is our critical water infrastructure. As Ranking Member Larson knows well from his leadership on this issue, small and mid-sized communities play a critical role in powering Washington State's economy, and they really define the 8th district. They face several barriers, though, when applying for funding from the bipartisan infrastructure law, including the lack of resources like dedicated staff and money to develop a competitive grant application. This could be not having the staff to do it. It could be not having the finances to do it. It could be just not having the prerequisite documentation. Financing is also an issue, and some of these grants require matching funds, which they cannot just keep up with if they are a small town. So having some standardization or specific support for those small and mid-sized cities as we keep oversight on the law would greatly help these smaller communities benefit. I also want to emphasize and elevate the importance of fish passage in Washington State. For the first time in the bipartisan infrastructure law, a new funding stream was championed to provide opportunities for salmon passage. This is particularly important in our state, where the Supreme Court has mandated that culverts be replaced by 2030, and so we have urgency in replacing these. Cities and counties are managing a lot of transportation and infrastructure pressures, everything from roads to salmon passage, and it would be nice for these smaller cities and towns to be able to have a way to bring all of these funding streams together, especially when they are small and medium-sized and don't have the typical resources that a large city or county would have. So some flexibility in matching requirements would be very helpful. Aviation, as you know, is also critical to Washington State. That is the home of Boeing. And it is not just Boeing, it's all the small businesses that support Boeing aircraft. We also see some struggles at our smaller airports, like Pangborn Airport in my district, where we've seen some decreases in service, in many ways due to a shortage of pilots. And that's why we need to think creatively about how to incentivize people into this line of work and how to be really strategic about recruitment. So to that end, I'm working with my Republican colleagues to introduce the American Aviator Act. This bill, similar to the one introduced by Senators Baldwin and Hoeven in the Senate, would establish a flight training program for veterans. And this bill presents an incredible opportunity for a couple of wins, to harness the talent and discipline and experience of our veterans and create an excellent long-term full-life career path. So I hope you'll consider this as you do the FAA reauthorization. Lastly, I wanted to mention WIFIA, the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act. And I have a bill as part of this that I intend to introduce in the upcoming months. This makes some common sense fixes, again, to broaden funding eligibility so that smaller areas can compete. Small towns just don't have the tax base to achieve matching funds. They need longer loan repayment periods. And so this would, again, help small local communities compete. I want to thank you for your consideration of all of these issues. Thank you for your service. Please extend those gratitudes to the chairman and ranking member. And thank you for your continued oversight of the bipartisan infrastructure law implementation. I look forward to working with you and my colleagues in both parties. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Schreier. Does anyone have any questions?
I'd just like to comment how deftly you got salmon into funding streams. I was very impressed.
No pun intended.
On that jolly note, I can assure you that your testimony will be included in our record. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. Next, the chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Representative Costa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. This committee plays an important role in our efforts to ensure that we focus on America's infrastructure. And I think the passage, the last Congress and the bipartisan infrastructure package gives us a lot of opportunities to make investments that, in part, long overdue and needed. We've been living, in my view, off the investments our parents and grandparents made a generation or two ago. I want to talk specifically of 3 areas that this committee focuses on: supply chains, the Federal Aviation Administration, and water resources development efforts and your oversight in these areas. Obviously, there are other important, critical areas that you deal with, but I think it's important in terms of lessons to be learned during this pandemic of the vulnerabilities of our supply chain, both interstate, intrastate, as well as our supply chains in terms of our ability to export American products. I think we've learned a few things, I hope we have, to bolster our supply chains internally and our ability to export, particularly around food. Food is a national security issue. It doesn't often get looked at that way, but I tell you, we're reauthorizing the Farm Bill this year, and it's one of the more bipartisan things we do. It is a national security matter. We worked to pass the Ocean Shipping Reform Act in the last Congress in a bipartisan fashion with Congressman members Garamendi and Dusty Johnson and myself and others to deal with the demurrage issue, to deal with the empty container issue. But we need to do more. We've been reintroduced again bipartisan legislation on Ocean Shipping Anti-Enforcement Act. 10 international companies control 90% of the international shipping in the world, and they need to be, I think, held accountable. My antitrust legislation would do that in the SHIP Act. It is a must-pass bill. The SHIP Act is separately, a must-pass bill that you're considering that deals with modernizing America's trucking system through a series of common-sense measures that reflect the 21st century. And I think this is bipartisan as well. Let me move on to water. As you know, we've had extreme weather conditions across the country, extreme droughts, extreme flooding. We've prayed and prayed and prayed in California for rain over the last 3 years, and we must have prayed really good because the last 3 months we've had a deluge of biblical proportions. But the snowpack is also creating a series of flooding in my district and other places that we need to deal with in terms of the Army Corps of Engineers for flood management, for levee repairs and recovery. We also need to look at regions of the country, including my area, where we need to have a regional flood plan, and we should work on this. And I want to provide support for the Army Corps of Engineers to do that as you contemplate WARDA for the next reauthorization next year. Certainly there are opportunities there for feasibility studies, specifically in my constituency, Red Bank and Fancher Creek's projects that would add additional recharge. You know, we need to recharge our groundwater, whether it's in the San Joaquin Valley or in the Midwest or other places where we've overdrafted. You know, I liken it to when I was in university and I got my first checking account, I thought it was pretty hot, and my father said, you know what, you can only write those checks as long as you're making deposits. And that's the problem with the overdrafting of our groundwater. So we need to do a lot there, I think, in infrastructure and finance innovation and WIFA program to introduce a bipartisan bill on non-federal entities that own federally owned infrastructure. And that can improve a lot of our aging water facilities. Finally, under the category of aviation and airport improvement projects, I think this committee needs to prioritize. And I'll tell you where I think you need to prioritize. Areas where we have National Guard facilities across this country, whether it's Air Force or Army Guard facilities, they get an incredible deal, our Department of Defense, by the municipalities operating these airports 24/7 for other purposes as well. And so these are really important bases that our Air National Guard around the country utilizes. In Fresno, we have the 144th Air National Guard. that has the squadrons of F-15 units, and they import a critical need for our national defense. So these are among many of the priorities I would urge you to consider, and I'll continue to work with this committee as we try to continue to invest in America's infrastructure. It's absolutely essential.
Thank you, Representative Costa. Does any member have any questions of the gentleman from California?
From California.
Do you have a position on duck and fee?
A position on what?
Duck and fee. Duck and fee.
Oh, yes, I do. I think that we need to, this is something that we should deal offline, but I'm very supportive of it.
Thank you for that. We'll make sure that your testimony, too, is included in our record. Thanks for being with us this afternoon. Next, the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Florida, Representative Luna.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ana Paulina Luna, and I represent Florida's 13th Congressional District. I wanted to express my priorities regarding the Water Resources Development Act, WRDA, and implementation of past WRDA provisions. My district is home to many pristine beaches. Actually, TripAdvisor said we're top 20 in the nation, so best beaches in the country. And it is my utmost priority to ensure beach renourishment continues in my community, which is why I'm standing before you today. The Army Corps of Engineers is delaying the renourishment of Sand Key Beach project here in Pinellas County. The initial construction effort for Sand Key was completed in 1993, and successive renourishments in 1999, 2006, 2012, and 2018 have been repaired and built up the beach significantly, with the shoreline now about 200 feet from the seawall. Renourishment needs to be placed every 6 years, and the next renourishment cycle would need to begin in 2024 to stay on schedule and not risk beach erosion that would degrade the progress made over the last 3 decades. However, before the next renourishment cycle may occur, the Army Corps has informed Pinellas County that local officials must obtain perpetual public easements along the length of the project from 100% of property owners, regardless of whether or not sand is being placed on their private property in the next renourishment cycle. For previous renourishments, Pinellas County property owners were allowed to use temporary construction easements to allow Army Corps to do its work. The Army Corps stated that the agency intends to start enforcing this new policy, purportedly from 1996, but not enforced for the last 2 decades. It is a flawed requirement to require perpetual public easements on private properties that will have sand placed, and for obvious reasons, about half of the private property owners have declined to give such easements. Army Corps is now threatening to cancel the project entirely. Section 103D of the 1986 Water Resources and Development Act requires local sponsors to pay for sand placed on private property. Army Corps of Engineers' new interpretation of the 40-year-old law said that they will not place sand on the public side of the beach, which is seaward of the erosion line, and unless perpetual public access easements is acquired for the private property owners on the landward side of the erosion control line, unless the local sponsor pays 100% of the cost. So basically, Army Corps is going back on their policy. They didn't enforce it, and now they're trying to stick our people back home with the price tag on it. And I'd like to add, I have this script here, but I'm just gonna go off script because you guys just need to hear it straight up. We have endangered species. This is going to completely impact our area. I mean, we have so much of our local tourism and economy focuses on our beaches, and if they don't do this, not only are we going to be putting our communities at risk for hurricanes and threats, but it's very likely that some of the endangered turtles that we have, loggerhead sea turtles, piping plotter shorebirds, West Indian manatees, eastern black rail, red knots, wood storks, American crocodiles, and eastern indigo snakes are all going to be at risk because their entire habitat is being destroyed. So I'm asking for your guys' help. This is my top priority for the WRDA 2024 to ensure that the Army Corps proceeds as planned with already authorized beach renourishment projects here in Florida. While the new Army Corps policies is personal to me and my constituents in Pinellas County, I'm sure that you will hear from many of my colleagues from the Florida delegation that they are probably facing similar issues. I respectfully request for your assistance in correcting the wayward Army Corps of Engineers and ensuring that the Sand Key project goes forward as scheduled. Thank you, Chairman. I yield my time.
Thank you, Representative Luna. Does anybody have any questions of Representative Luna? For that, we'll put your testimony in the record.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Now the gentleman from Illinois, Representative Danny Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ranking member, and members of the committee. As Congress considers the FAA reauthorization, I respectfully ask your leadership in addressing the racial and ethnic disparities in aviation. Being an aircraft pilot is an in-demand, high-paying profession, with the median annual wage for a commercial pilot being over $134,000 a year. Unfortunately, the aviation industry is impressively homogeneous. According to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, 95.7% of aviation pilots and engineers in 2022 were white, with only 9.7% being Hispanic Latino, 2.6% being Black, and 1.6% being Asian. Approximately 90.8% of aviation pilots and engineers are men. Congress has an opportunity to help individuals enter aviation careers while increasing the diversity of the field. The high cost of training is a key barrier to entering the profession, especially for people of color. Pilot training can cost between $80,000 to $100,000 a year. Substantial federal investment is required to help address the immediate need to increase the aviation workforce with a focus on individuals currently underrepresented in the profession. The Aviation Workforce Development Grants Program invests in training and diversification of aircraft pilots and aviation maintenance workers. In FY23, the Aircraft Pilot Program and the Aviation Maintenance Program received only $5 million and $10 million respectively. Support in the House for these programs was evident last year when my amendment to increase funding for these grants passed during floor consideration of the Transportation Appropriation Bill. Further, I ask that the committee improve pilot diversity by including language to expand partnerships with historically Black colleges and universities, tribal colleges and universities, the 5 minority serving institutions, including predominantly Black institutions, Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander service institutions, Alaska Native and Native Hawaiian serving institutions, Hispanic serving institutions, and Native American serving non-tribal institutions. These institutions have experience in educating and graduating low-income students of color. Indeed, such partnerships have helped diversify many important fields, including defense, science, and technology. Collaborating with these institutions is an effective way for aviation policy to target grants to students from racial, ethnic backgrounds with financial need. In closing, I want to recognize my friend and colleague, Representative Hank Johnson from Georgia, for his leadership on diversifying aviation education. I urge my colleagues to use your leadership on aviation policy to help individuals enter aviation careers while increasing the diversity of the field. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Does anybody have any questions of Representative Danny Davis? No questions, and we'll make sure that your testimony is added to the record.
Thank you.
I now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Representative Soto, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member, for this opportunity. I know it's a long and arduous hearing, but we appreciate you being generous with your time and patience, knowing after passing the bipartisan infrastructure law, our nation and this committee has a huge responsibility that affects all members, so I appreciate the opportunity. We in Central Florida are home to Orlando International Airport, where we expect to host about 1.7 million passengers per week by the end of 2023. People are traveling again. And timely reauthorization of the Federal Aviation Administration Reauthorization Bill, the FAA reauthorization, is incredibly important to ensure a safe and efficient travel experience, a robust travel experience and opportunities for all Americans. My priorities in 2023 FAA reauthorization include several points. First, increased funding and flexibility of funds for the Airport Improvement Program. We see a lot of these being deployed right now, but as new projects come up, being allowed to have AIP eligibility for all activities allowed under the Passenger Fare Charge Program, the PFC, as outlined in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, along with FAA requirements for mandate programmatic funding priorities that are in new eligibility into account. We need this flexibility for our airports and the increased authorized funding for AIP to a minimum of $4 billion annually. Second, addressing aviation industry workforce shortages. I support steps to address such as increasing federal student loan aid for pilot training, extending and increasing funding for aviation workforce development grants to $10 million annually, and continued support for programs such as the FAA's Minority Serving Institutions Internship Program, which promotes diversity in aviation workforce. Additionally, I support efforts to provide aviation student housing on airport properties. I recently was in our smaller municipal airport in Kissimmee, and they are not only focusing on executive travel, having Orlando International Airport just a few miles away, but also in training new pilots and new mechanics. And right now, student housing is not considered compatible with our local airports, and by having this on Kissimmee Airport and other airports across the nation, this will help us in allowing pilots to stay close to these training facilities and help with this pilot shortage we've heard from a lot of folks today. Also, it's critical that we have airspace integration between space launch and reentry. I support authorization of no less than $10 million in the fiscal year 2024 through 2028 to expedite development, acquisition, and deployment of technologies that help with this. In Central Florida, we have 53 flights last year, space flights. This year we'll have 83 launching from Cape Canaveral. So as we're working on ensuring America's space leadership, coordinating with airports is going to be absolutely critical going forward. In addition, it's key to improve customer experience for the hearing impaired. We want to make sure our seniors, our folks with disabilities, have equal access. And so we support the air travel needs of passengers with disabilities established in SEC 439 of the 2018 FAA reauthorization. In addition, we support the requirement of the committee to submit its annual report to Congress of a list of policy recommendations and how Congress, the Department of Transportation, and airlines can help those who need closed captions to get through the airport and to their destination. In addition, improving customer experience with regard to the use of airline vouchers, having clear printed policies and using conspicuous verbiage and language for blackout dates and expiration dates of vouchers are key. As you can appreciate, over the holiday season, a lot of folks had some flights that they missed, and knowing how they can get back on track and take that family vacation to Orlando or other destinations across the United States and abroad, very key to make sure people know how those vouchers work. Also, priority authorizing funding for federal contract air traffic control towers, for the aircraft rescue and firefighter truck program, for taxiway Delta extension program, unmanned aerial systems, and the transitional plan for PFAS remediation. We got a lot going on in Orlando with airports, so this is a huge part for our district. So just thank you for the time, and gentlemen, both of you, and thank you to your staff for giving us the opportunity today.
Thank you, Representative Soto. Does anyone have any questions?
I got one. Cape Canaveral or Cape Kennedy?
Cape Kennedy is a part of Cape Canaveral. So both coexist. But we have the Kennedy Space Center. So President Kennedy's great legacy is still enshrined to this day, just like President Johnson. And space has always been a bipartisan thing. We want to keep it that way. We saw our last couple presidents really invest in getting forward. And I'm proud to say, gentlemen, that we are now regularly launching from America's soil again and have been for about 2-3 years now. I know that's critical to everyone. And but your committee plays a key role.
You could put Elon Musk in one of those things and just send him into deep space.
We appreciate the role of the commercial sector, and I can tell you, whether it's SpaceX, Blue Origin, ULA, or the many other commercial space companies that are operating at Cape Canaveral, they're all important parts of it, in addition to NASA and my constituent, Administrator Nelson, as well. So we'll focus on the productive here today, Representative Cohen. I think that'll get us a long way. Thank you. Appreciate the time, gentlemen.
Thank you, Representative Soto. Your testimony will be included in the record.
The committee will recess subject to the chair.
The committee will now recess, subject to the chair.
Okay.
The Transportation and Infrastructure Committee will now reconvene. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Representative Goldman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Larson, for inviting me to testify before the committee today on the transportation and infrastructure issues that are particularly important to my district, New York 10, which covers Lower Manhattan and a large part of Northwest Brooklyn. As you know, New York City is the most densely populated city in the country. Our public transportation system and our transit infrastructure are the busiest in the nation and are under immense stress. The historic passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act last Congress provided us the opportunity to begin to address some of the most pressing issues in my district. But our work is far from over. As you work to reauthorize transportation and infrastructure programs this Congress, I'd like to call to your attention a few of my district's priorities. First, we must make sure that our most marginalized communities are not left behind by the renovation of the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. The BQE is one of the most traveled highways in New York State and is a notoriously disruptive corridor in my district. The communities surrounding the highway have been unjustly segregated by its physical infrastructure since the 1950s, when it was designed to spare wealthier neighborhoods from disturbance. Perpetuating inequities even further, the overwhelming pollution and heavy traffic that the highway produces have disproportionately affected these already vulnerable communities, exposing them to toxic fumes, dangerous pedestrian conditions, and contributing to higher rates of asthma than normal. Ensuring that federal dollars go to protecting the health and environment of the surrounding communities while the dilapidated central portion of the BQE undergoes construction is a top priority of mine. This is an environmental justice issue, and I ask that the committee continue to support and oversee programs such as the newly created Reconnecting Communities Grant Program, as well as infra and mega grants to support all communities, including those in my district that historically have been overlooked. Second, I am asking the committee to prioritize rigorous oversight of the EPA's massively important state revolving funds, which received $50 billion in funding through the bipartisan infrastructure law. The goal of the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Funds is to upgrade and strengthen our national water and stormwater systems, so no American is exposed to unsafe drinking water, and our communities have the resources they need to protect themselves from increasingly severe flooding and extreme weather conditions. Unfortunately, these investments have not always been equitably distributed, predominantly excluding communities of color, where continued dismissal of their needs has compounded, leaving them with aging, outdated, and hazardous water systems. A recent report by the National Resource Defense Council found that municipalities with larger white populations were more likely to receive support from the Clean Water State Revolving Funds than others. My district includes communities that suffer from this inequity. Further still, a number of these marginalized neighborhoods are on low-lying topography, and they desperately need federal funds to help mitigate inland flooding and increase capacity for safe and effective stormwater management. In order to ensure that federal investments in state revolving funds through the bipartisan infrastructure law benefit all Americans, the committee must oversee the fair distribution of the funds by states with rigorous oversight and accountability. Finally, I strongly urge the committee to advance a bill I have co-sponsored, the Safe and Quiet Skies Act, as you go through the reauthorization of the FAA process this year. The legislation would restrict commercial air tours and non-essential helicopter flights, protecting our communities and sparing them the constant and severe disruption that they cause through both noise and air pollution. The density of my community makes the threat of a localized helicopter or small aircraft crash very dangerous. Since 1983, we've had at least 30 helicopter crashes in our region, with at least 25 fatalities, according to the NTSB records. These non-essential flights catering to tourists have continued to grow, In the last 5 years, noise complaints have gone up in New York City by more than 2,300%. In addition to noise and severe vibrations, the excessive use of fossil fuels by helicopters further harms our environment. It is imperative that these operations be much more tightly regulated for the health, safety, and quality of life in our communities. Thank you again, Chairman, for your time and consideration today.
Thank you, Mr. Goldman. Does anyone have any questions of Mr. Goldman? No questions? Your testimony will be added to the record.
Thank you.
I now recognize the gentlelady from California, Representative Porter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The reauthorization of the Federal Aviation Administration sure is bringing a lot of members with their hands out. But with good reason. We should all want better for airline passengers, whether that's somebody making a trip across the country for a funeral or to pitch a new business. But year after year, people who step on an airplane are not having a good time, and sometimes not even getting to their destinations. Some were victims of, honey, I shrunk the airplane seat. Some had their flights canceled or significantly delayed, often due to meltdowns caused by airlines' underinvestment in technology and tools. With the flightmares that people endure, we can't let a good reauthorization go to waste. Let's get this right, Democrat or Republican. This stuff gets on everyone's nerves. Let's start with an easy one. What's 72 inches tall but fits in a 31-inch space? A miserable passenger struggling to sit in the airplane seat they paid hundreds of dollars for. The FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018 required the FAA to establish minimum dimensions for passenger seats. It hasn't happened. The law passed almost 5 years ago, and since the FAA has not acted, now we must. Is anyone here against telling the airlines not to shrink their seats any further until the FAA acts? Good. Then let's advance my Stop Airplane Seat Shrinking Act to require the FAA to prevent seat size reductions until they've done their rulemaking. Now, how about the FAA issues some minimum requirements for airlines to maintain safe and workable flight planning systems? Last December, because of outdated software, Southwest Airlines canceled more than 16,700 flights and stranded thousands. Today, the exact same thing happened. I'd like permission to enter into the record this headline, published today, Tuesday, April 18th. Southwest Airlines delayed more than 1,500 flights. Southwest had a meltdown over its technology problems. Let's advance my Flightmare Prevention Act, because we need to do something about Southwest's scheduling system that is straight out of the 1990s and their failure to invest to upgrade it. The Flightmare Prevention Act would require the FAA to issue minimum requirements for airlines' enterprise resource planning systems. Now, to be clear, it's not just technology, though, that's tripping up our aviation system. It's also staffing. My home airport, Orange County, cannot get the air traffic controllers that it needs. Why? Because the FAA restricts where they can get available staff. Right now, Orange County's airport is considered level 8 based on its volumes of arrivals and departures. Unlike smaller airports, it classified from 4 to 7, it cannot pull cadets from the FAA Traffic Control Academy and the National Employee Service NEST transfers. And unlike larger airports, classified from 9 to 12, it cannot offer comparably higher pay. We shouldn't be catching airports like mine between a rock and a hard place. The FAA needs to make level 8 airports eligible for the air traffic controllers that they need. It's simple. If we have air traffic controllers, we can move planes and our aviation system functions more smoothly for passengers. We've talked a lot about the things that we can do to prevent flight mares, but even with improvements, severe delays and cancellations can happen. What do airlines owe passengers when they don't actually deliver them to their destinations? To start, 6 of the 10 major airlines have already pledged to reschedule their passengers on another airline when there is a controllable, significant delay or cancellation. Plus, the FAA already has guidance to require refunds for passengers who do not fly after a significant delay or cancellation. I say let's combine these ideas. My Choices for Stranded Travelers Act would require airlines with controllable significant delays and cancellations to get their passengers faster alternative transportation, or if the passenger chooses, they can still get that full cash refund. Now, even if we advance all of the solutions I've talked about, implementing them requires a strong FAA. So the last request I have today is to pass my FAA Engagement and Transparency Act, which will require the FAA to appear annually before this committee to answer Congress members' questions and talk about the work it is doing to engage the public. I respectfully request that the committee include the solutions I've proposed today in its reauthorization. Let's stop flight mares, and let's make our aviation system work better for the people we serve. I yield back.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions of Representative Porter? Thank you. Your testimony will be added to the record. I now recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Representative Crow, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman and members of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. We appreciate you holding this forum for me and other members to share with the committee our views and concerns regarding the reauthorization of the Federal Aviation Administration. I proudly represent Colorado's 6th Congressional District, and I'm one of several members of Congress who are a part of the Quiet Skies Caucus. My district is home to Centennial Airport, which is the nation's 2nd busiest general aviation airport. The FAA has been entrusted with ensuring aviation safety, which is a serious concern for residents in my district who live below the flight path. In fact, we had a mid-air collision near Centennial Airport in 2021. Community members remain deeply concerned about subsequent changes at the airport and any future accident that could endanger both those in the air and on the ground. Many of my constituents have serious concerns about the impact that concentrated flights also have on their homes, their children, our community, and our health. To start, residents are concerned about health risks, particularly to children and pregnant women, from exposure to high levels of lead from aviation fuel emissions. Additionally, residents are pained by the frequent high decibel noise from planes overheard that disrupt their homes, schools, and parks. Residents' mental health and way of life are being impacted. On multiple occasions since 2022, constituents have expressed to my staff that the constant disruption is intolerable and make their homes feel virtually unlivable. Far too often, the FAA and others have dismissed these concerns and not given them their full attention. The FAA needs to be more responsive to community concerns in concert with local officials, and I ask the committee to seriously consider new mandates. At the Centennial Airport, a noise roundtable has been established, and a noise abatement guide exists. Local public officials, the Arapahoe County Public Airport Authority, and residents are working with the FAA. However, the FAA has not always attended their meetings, and we should require a better response from them to address all of our community's concerns. Recently, the chair of the Arapahoe County Board of Commissioners, Warren Gully, Greenwood Village Mayor Lance, Arapahoe County Public Airport Authority Chair Bagnato, and Centennial Airport Noise Roundtable Chair Pierce requested greater local control to address aircraft noise issues. They have specifically requested that the FAA be required to take both safety and noise abatement into account when working in concert with local airport and communities. In addition, they are seeking the assignment of FAA technical experts to the newly created Sub-Roundtable Technical Working Group and regular participation with community groups, the Centennial Airport Community Noise Roundtable, and the airport to address aviation issues. They have further requested the creation of new financial incentives to accelerate the production and distribution of alternative unleaded fuels. As you proceed with the reauthorization of the FAA, we implore you that any new legislation address the concerns of communities on the ground who endure the consequences of inaction every day. There must be stronger requirements to address the noise, environmental, health, and safety issues impacting those underneath flight paths. Additionally, I request that the committee include meaningful requirements that will accelerate the transition away from leaded aviation fuel to safer, more environmentally conscious alternatives. I and members of the Congressional Quiet Skies Caucus have repeatedly made requests for changes at the FAA. And it is time for the Transportation Infrastructure Committee to make meaningful changes to the FAA's authorizing statute that require greater protection for the health and safety of families in my district and around the country, and require them to engage with our local communities and local leaders. I thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today, and I yield back.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions to Representative Crow? No questions. Your testimony will be added to the record. I now recognize a gentlelady from Washington, Representative Lusenkamp Perez, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Larson, for the opportunity to testify today. My district in Southwest Washington has some infrastructure needs that are common to many districts, like repairing water systems, fixing our roads, and improving our freight railroads. But my district also has some unique needs I'd like to address today. First and foremost, my district is home to one of the largest, most complex, and most nationally important bridge replacement projects in the country. The I-5 bridge over the Columbia River was actually just celebrated its 107th birthday on Valentine's Day. That is a lot of candles on a cake. This bridge is a critical stretch of I-5 and it has been rated functionally obsolete by the Department of Transportation. Congestion clogs the bridge for as many as 10 hours a day, and it is highly vulnerable to an earthquake. Someone once described, actually our mayor in Vancouver regularly describes it as a bridge that was built on pretzel sticks driven into chocolate pudding. In January, Ranking Member Larson got the chance to meet with the bridge replacement team firsthand to better understand why replacing the bridge is so critical. The Interstate Bridge Replacement Project, or the IBR, is necessary to reduce congestion and meet travel demand, address significant earthquake vulnerability, improve safety, increase freight movement and efficiency, create safe paths for bicycles and pedestrians, and expand transportation opportunities. This project is big, and it cannot happen without federal help. So I appreciate the committee's ongoing support for key surface transportation and transit programs. Federal programs created or bolstered the bipartisan infrastructure law will be critical to the project's success, including the Bridge Investment Program, Capital Investment Grant Program, and the Mega Grant Program. And just last month, I led a bipartisan letter to the Appropriations Committee requesting full funding for the Bridge Investment Program. I want to make sure the committee knows how critical this project is to my district, to the Northwest, and to the nation. Next, I'd like to discuss the importance of port and waterway programs. As both the chairman and the ranking member know, our country's ports and working waterways are critical infrastructure. Nearly 40% of the jobs in my home state of Washington are tied to international trade. We are the most trade-dependent state in the most trade-dependent region in the country. Not too long ago, Ranking Member Larson and I met up at the Port of Kalama, where we heard straight from the source about the key infrastructure needs that some of our ports share, like investments in turning basins and dredging. What I hear time and time again is that they need federal programs that meet their needs and have funding to back it up. I'm supportive of doing anything we can to expand port programs like the PIDP, the Small Shipyard Grant Program, the Marine Highway Program. I also support expanding multimodal grant and loan programs like RAISE, Infra, and TIFA to work better for our ports. And it isn't just physical infrastructure that needs more investment. Our workforce does as well. The maritime workforce has dealt with many of the same issues that other sectors face, and the federal government's antiquated systems have hindered efforts. We must start modernizing existing maritime workforce programs. And we need to ensure new workforce programs are working the way they should, like they have in much of Southwest Washington. I have been so proud to see MARAD select PAC Maritime as a Center for Excellence for Domestic Maritime Workforce Training and Education. Their Vancouver program at Clark College is working on the ground to ensure this region can meet the maritime needs workforce of the future. And briefly, I want to voice my support for the Army Corps' many roles in maintaining our navigable waterways. From dredging to operating the hydropower dams of the Columbia River, the Corps is a key partner in our region. My district is also home to Mount St. Helens. The Corps' long-term work protecting Cowlitz County through flood protection, sediment monitoring, and sediment management is vital to protect rivers, fish habitats, and communities. And before I move on, I also want to note my ongoing support for the Jones Act. Protecting American workers in shipyards is crucial for both economic and national security. Last, I'd like to discuss a few priorities of mine that are relevant to the ongoing FAA reauthorization process. First, I strongly support the efforts to bolster workforce development programs through reauthorization. I'm supportive of the efforts led by Ranking Member Larson to expand the aviation workforce development grants programs to cover more aviation professions and increase funding for grants. I also support the efforts to expand the airport improvement project so that airports can use funds for resiliency. As I touched on before, the Northwest has unique seismic vulnerabilities. I want to thank Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Larson once again for giving me the opportunity to testify again, and I look forward to working with you both to deliver for communities in Southwest Washington. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? No questions, then your testimony will be added to the record. I now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Representative Fitzpatrick, for 5 minutes.
Thank the chairman and the ranking member for having us here today. And as you begin the difficult task of authoring the FAA Reauthorization Act this year, I strongly urge this committee, which I formerly served on, to prioritize the safety and well-being of the American people, both in the skies and on the ground. Last July, as a member of this committee, I raised the issue of secondary cockpit barriers to Secretary Buttigieg, and I shared the story of my constituent, Captain Victor Saraceni. As many of you know, Captain Saraceni's aircraft, which he piloted, United Flight 175, was hijacked on September 11th of 2001 and flown into the World Trade Center. It was the second airplane that the entire world watched in horror. After any tragedy, all of our first question is always, what could we have done differently to prevent this from happening? While there are many answers in this case, secondary cockpit barriers are certainly one of the best answers. Despite being included among the recommendations issued nearly 2 decades ago by the 9/11 Commission and as a requirement for new aircraft in the last FAA reauthorization bill over 4 years ago, few commercial planes have secondary barriers and the flight deck remains vulnerable. This is several decades after 9/11. We must keep our commitment to saying never again, preventing terrorists from infiltrating the cockpit and using commercial airliners like a guided missile. I urge the committee to exercise oversight over the Department of Transportation in this case, as I am, and call on Secretary Buttigieg to issue the final rule that was due back in 2019. Moreover, as you consider this year's FAA reauthorization, I urge you to include H.R. 911, the Saraceni Enhanced Aviation Safety Act. This is a bipartisan bill which I introduced in February, along with Representatives Carson, Gottheimer, Keene, Lynch, and Smith. A bipartisan bill across the board would extend the implementation of this low-cost security measure to all commercial aircraft in the United States. The security of the flight deck is essential to the safety of our pilots, flight crews, passengers, and their families. And as co-chair of the, and I thank you for consideration of that, and as co-chair of the Bipartisan Disabilities Caucus, I would also like to encourage the committee to continue to improve airport and aircraft accessibility. While some progress has been made, when I speak to my constituents that have rare diseases and disabilities, much more work needs to be done to ensure that the boarding, in-flight, and deplaning experiences of those with disabilities are improved across the board. Passengers deserve transparency. That's why I joined Ranking Member Cohen and Senators Duckworth and Fisher to introduce the Prioritizing Accessibility and Accountability for Aviation Consumers Act. This bill would ensure accountability from the airlines and the Department of Transportation with regard to their effectiveness in directly resolving disability-related complaints. And I strongly urge the committee to consider the inclusion of this bipartisan bicameral initiative in the FAA Reauthorization Act. And lastly, Mr. Chairman, the noise pollution caused by aircraft and airports, when not addressed, is an unacceptable encroachment on so many of our communities, their health, their well-being, and their safety, those of us that represent districts in and around airport regions. For my local constituents, the Trenton Mercer Airport, although located in an entirely different state in Trenton, New Jersey, is situated such that planes take off and approach over Lower Bucks County, unnecessarily disturbing residents and disrupting daily life. While small in size, this airport has sought to expand by adding 2 fully operational gates. Despite the fact that this will increase the number of annual flights by the thousands, The Trenton Mercer Airport has failed to account for the impact these new gates will have or to implement any noise reduction or mitigation strategies whatsoever. Congress can and must address the health and safety issues caused by aviation-related noise pollution, especially for vulnerable and underserved communities. And last week, I was proud to join Representative Lynch in proposing a step in the right direction, the Air Traffic Noise and Pollution Expert Consensus Act. This bipartisan piece of legislation will urge, which I urge this committee to consider for inclusion, and the FAA reauthorization would require a report on the health impacts of air traffic noise and pollution. And when making critical decisions about airports like Trenton Mercer, the FAA should have to consider the opinion of our nation's experts. Our community should not be left behind by Washington bureaucrats. Again, I thank you for the opportunity to testify today to both the chair and the ranking member. I look forward to continuing my work with this committee and all my colleagues on common ground, common sense solutions to transportation and infrastructure challenges in this upcoming Congress. Thank you for your time, and I yield back.
Does anyone have any questions of Mr. Fitzpatrick? No questions? All right, your testimony will be added to the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you all. That concludes today's member participation. And that concludes our hearing today. I would like to thank each and every one of you and the witnesses for your testimony. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such a time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. The committee stands adjourned.